shouting things that you probably couldn't hear, but if you're interested, on Monday morning, there's going to be a photography team on campus to shoot the lobby of the East dorm at 8:30 in the morning, and they're looking for people, students, to be in the background. So if you want to learn about a photo shoot and maybe be in it, 8:30 in the morning on Monday, okay? Spread the word, too. So I want to thank everybody for coming. Every year, the College of Architecture and Design lecture series devotes one evening to something special, and that is a presentation by one of our own, the graduate student who wins the Earl Pellerin Traveling Fellowship. So that's why we're here tonight. And we're going to have a lecture by last year's award winner, followed by the announcement of the nominees for this year and the winner of this year's Traveling Fellowship. So let's get things started by I'm going to introduce the chair of the Alumni and Design Cabinet for Lawrence Tech University, Meagan Martin Campbell, who will introduce tonight's speaker. So please welcome Meagan.
Good to see a good crowd out here tonight. First of all, I want to thank everyone for coming tonight, and thank you for that introduction. On behalf of the Alumni Cabinet and the College of Architecture and Design, I'd like to welcome you to this year's Pelerin Traveling Fellowship presentation. Before we get going on the presentation and hear from our current fellow, I'd like to take a few moments to thank a few individuals that really make this event happen every year. From the College of Architecture and Design, I wanted to thank Dean Carl Dobman and Professor Deidre Henneberry. Behind the scenes, they work tirelessly to curate a high-quality lecture series and a rotating exhibit in the Brick Gallery. Department Chair Steve Ross and Assistant Scott Shaw are valuable sounding boards for us on the cabinet. They're at our bi-monthly meetings, and they're always there with an opinion and good advice. I also like to thank Professor Dale Geyer, who has acted as the faculty advisor for the Pelerin Traveling Fellowship. And also just a general shout out to all the graduate professors that if it wasn't for their tireless effort with all of their students, that we wouldn't have the quality proposals that we get every year. So thank you for that. And lastly, I wanted to thank the cabinet. I know there's a few of us that are here tonight, and I just wanted to recognize that 9-body cabinet, where we are elected by our peers, and we each serve a 3-year term. It's our goal in the cabinet to provide initiatives which provide the ongoing development and success of our alumni, so that they may continue to gain value and support from LTU after graduation. If you're interested in helping our efforts into the design community, we welcome new members every spring. So please feel free to reach out to me or any of the other cabinet members that are here tonight. Or there's also a way to reach us on the Facebook page or on the website or other social media. Get the word out. So enough about the cabinet. This award was established by this cabinet, and it's in honor of Dr. Earl Pellerin. The fellowship provides a unique educational value to students that have the commitment and determination to enhance the design community. Earl Pellerin was our first professor of architecture. He was a member of our faculty for 42 years, and he was the founding dean of the College of Architecture and Design here at LTU. He believed that travel was an essential part of an architect's education. The Pelerin Traveling Fellowship honors one faculty-nominated meritorious graduate student annually. Nominated students have demonstrated exceptional talent in their design and theory practices in studios. Please stay tuned after this lecture for more about this year's nominees, as well as the announcement, as Professor Geyer mentioned, of the next year's fellow. So with that, I would like to introduce the 2018 Pellerin Fellow for his lecture tonight. At this time last year, Erik Knauss was announced as a 2018 Pellerin Traveling Fellowship recipient. Erik works at Inform Studio, a firm founded by LTU alumni, whom at their core strive to be visionary. Having worked with Erik Erik has been an incredible asset to the firm. He strives for excellence in every task, no matter how big or how small or how complicated. Also, Erik has shown to be incorruptible, which is a valuable asset in this field.
We'll see after Monday.
He's here tonight to present his travel studies in Finland, where he sought to further investigate the cultural and economic value of exposed structural timber through research he dubbed natural tectonic craft. But I'll let him cover that in detail. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Erik Knauss.
I don't think I knew that. All right. Well, all my secrets were exposed on the first slide. There we go. Am I connected too? All right. So thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. I really appreciate the showing. I want to say thank you to the LT Architecture Alumni Association for setting up this award each year. I can truly appreciate it as someone who has never really traveled any farther than St. Louis before this time. It's been a lot of firsts for me. First time getting on an airplane, 5 actually on this trip. First time being out of the country, and then first time being here instead of sitting there. So it's pretty cool so far. I want to thank specifically Jim Stevens for the nomination and all the help that he gave me in the Make Lab and setting me up for this, for Carl and Dale and Deidre and Meagan for helping organize the logistics, and then my family for supporting me through all the work and time it took this past year, and then also my Inform family for providing me with the opportunity and the time to invest in this and all the support. So with that, when I set out to do this, I wanted to kind of do something that was practical to our field, and then also take advantage of the adventure aspect of what a traveling fellowship could be. Building with wood has become a prominent topic in our field as we go to a more sustainable trajectory in architecture. I'd say the last 10 years or so, that's been building momentum, especially in the west coast of the United States, as we're seeing building codes transition into more leniency with how tall we can build with timber, and it's becoming more and more part of the narrative. So the goal for me was to find a place that aligned with the idea of natural tectonic craft, building with mass timber, trying to locate someone or some entity that did it really well and seeing what we could learn from them in the States. So about me, Meagan already kind of covered it in good enough detail, so I'll be very brief. Graduated LTU 2017 in the summer with my master's in architecture. Spent some time in the Make Lab, which really helped kind of set up my ideas about what makes effective architecture, my design conceits, and putting my degree to good use at Inform Studio. Trying not to get corrupted by the by the SaaS nature, but it's an awesome place to work. It's probably the best place to work if you graduated LTU and worked in the Make Lab, because we probably have like 90% of representation of those two alumnus bases at Inform. And then finally, I'm actually back at LTU teaching VisCom 4 with my colleague Zuby, and it's been a blast so far, so it's great to be back. So in the Make Lab, what kind of got all this started was Jim and I were interested in this idea of digital tectonics, and how we can link studies of past traditions, specifically with Renaissance era stereotomy, and reinterpret it through new tool sets to gain new knowledge. And this not only helped the Make Lab and his pursuits, but it also helped me develop a further understanding of how I place value on specific architectural principles. The first one was that architecture is a very innately human process and output. So Kenneth Frampton describes this as tectonics and critical regionalism, where the architecture is tailored to the users and is evident or honest in how that is portrayed formally through the connections and how the building meets the ground and interacts with the users. Secondly, I believe that effective architecture is craft-based and is tactile in order to set up relationships with the human body, which is what experiences space. I think that is an important quality that good architecture has. And finally, I respect a lot the natural aspect of architecture in terms of materiality that Juhani Palasma displays in his work, Alvar Aalto, not coincidentally, Finnish architects, names from that region. So this all set up a kind of framework that we had studied. We went back, we took a look at how a block of stone is set up, how it's cut, how it's drawn, and then we tried to translate that to digital tool sets using CATIA, Rhino, Grasshopper, CNC. And we tried to link this theory of digital tectonics with handcraft and then how that manifests itself today in a digital era. And I totally thought that's where my Pelerin research would apply itself. But as I got further into this, I was looking at wood joinery, how logs connect with each other, and I thought, okay, that's what it's going to be. But in the preview of my research options, what struck me is images like this, where two logs are coming together perpendicularly, but this ornate pattern is carved into their material that they're using. And it made me ask, like, why is this a thing? Like, why is there such care involved in a joint? Why does it need to be there? So what really spurred me on for the majority of my research is what is rooted in the cultural attitude towards building with wood, because I had already identified that the Finnish culture has a strong mastery on this area. And furthermore, what makes the building tradition important today that we can learn from their expertise and reapply back into what we're trying to get at with sustainability in mind and reinterpreting the material as its technological abilities advance farther. And then finally, I'm kind of alluding to a point where I almost see this as like a new material renaissance coming, where wood comes back to the forefront in the face of concrete and steel, which is what we've been using for years and years since the Industrial Revolution. And I think embedded in my studies in Finland, there's some evidence there that this is on the horizon and we should be paying attention to what the Finns are doing. So why Finland? There's a few reasons, actually. The first are Finns have developed a true mastery of the material over the years, almost to the point of it being crazy. So all around Aalto University were these inspirational signs like we have here, like possible is everything. Their possible is everything is cattle all over the world. We're eating Finnish wood. What would that look like? Secondarily, Finland, Helsinki specifically, is pretty well renowned worldly for their sustainability practices. And I think this was an important step as to the development of using timber as a building material, because it's embodied sustainability and can be recycled, reused, and it highlights this reuse culture that they're trying to instill nationwide throughout their country, really. As evidence here, I just threw this one in here because their environmental health results are top of the list. So it starts basically at a governmental level where they have policy. I wasn't able to go to the grocery store and buy a plastic bag. I had to bring my backpack or purchase a paper bag. I wasn't drinking out of plastic bottles. I was drinking out of glass. So that kind of culture permeates throughout. Thirdly, why to go to Finland is the ancillary richness of architecture just in general, not even limited to timber tectonics. You have names like Rainer Malamäki, Alvar Aalto, Ilil and Eero Saarinen, and Juhani Palasma, who is a personal architectural hero of mine. And then fourthly, but not least, is I actually have family ties to the region. My father's side of the family actually emigrated from Finland and moved to the UP. And they're from a little town here called Ilivieska. It was a farming community. And I wasn't able to visit exactly that region, but it felt like I was getting the best bang for my buck by kind of visiting the homeland and being able to experience a culture that was emphasizing sustainability, seeing all this architecture, and pursuing a research goal all at once. So it was really quite a big blessing. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the concept of sisu in a presentation talking about Finland. And it sets up kind of why or how their culture of perseverance and strength expanded. So sisu is a special strength and persistent determination and resolve to continue and overcome in moments of adversity, an almost magical quality, a combination of stamina, perseverance, courage, and determination held in reserve for hard times. And this was important because essentially for 8 centuries, the Finnish people were basically oppressed by different regimes. In the early years, it was a power struggle between the Swedes and the Russians. Until the 1600s, up to about 200 years after, the Swedes were in complete control over the region. And then the Russians took it back as Finland became a Grand Duchy of the Russian Tsar up until 1917, which they gained independence. And they just recently celebrated their 100th anniversary of independence. And what the government did is they contracted out the Helsinki Public Library as a symbol, as a gift to the people of this momentous occasion. And this is what it looked like when I was there, still under construction. This is actually from the porch of Finlandia Hall by Alvar Aalto. And that's what it looks like a month ago. So I see great significance in this building. It goes beyond just being a wooden form or using timber tectonics in the architecture. I believe it represents the desired vernacular moving forward in Finland because there's this strong connection with the forest, with the wood, and people are holding on to that as part of the culture. And I see that as one of the driving principles of why they have been able to develop this mastercraft and use of the material. Because this was the reality for most of the country's history. Pictured here are what are known as forest Finns, and they're performing slash and burn agricultural techniques. So what they do is they basically clear cut a section of forest, plant their crop, which was probably rye to grow bread, and survive off the land. So immediately you have this connection between the people and the forest. That was like their main sustenance, keeping them alive. For context, Finland was and is Europe's most heavily forested country. So there is 23 million hectares, or 74.2% of land area that's all forest. That's the most in Europe. And what's interesting is after they gained independence, that number has actually steadily increased over the years based on a better ability to manage the forest and increase responsible practices. And it all started with the trade of the hand. So the Bila axe, there's a whole cultural following with the Bila axe, but essentially hand hewing was learned at a young age because the men, the older generations, were off fighting in the military, and the younger boys had to take care of the household and were able to learn the woodcutting skills early on. So this basically set up this rich culture of learning how to work with the material, and leads into kind of Finland's early vernacular of architecture, which is built on the horizontal log. So the horizontal log was always available. It was easy to process. It had austerity and clarity of tectonics, and it resulted in things like this, which were simple rectangular forms with sloped roofs. These small little farming communities sprouted out across the land. And in tandem with that, in the south, on the Baltic Sea, the log was also developed for shipbuilding. So this expertise is slowly increasing as they're working the material in different ways. At this point, there were no architects designing any type of municipal building. It was mainly the skilled craftsmen and the farmers that had developed this knowledge of the material. And there became a need for larger buildings as cities got larger, and most of the time these were churches. The two major religious strains throughout Finland was the Orthodoxy, and their major vernacular was Masonry, and then Christianity, which was a more conservative side of the religious strain. And they relied on this wood tectonics to kind of preserve that conservative feel in their building. So traditionally, the governing principle of early timber construction was the module of about 5.5 meters or 16 feet, which was the economic dimension of a log. 16 feet was the maximum dimension of a room, therefore. But around the 17th century, there was a need to increase the height and length of buildings. A sermon could be just as effective in a 16 square foot room, but they needed it to get bigger. So there was a problem at hand, is how to get the log in an increased dimension. So enter the tukipilari, or log pillar, and this was implemented into wood church building, adapted from the Swedish architects who actually had a pretty good handle on the tectonics at the time. But the Finnish farmers saw what was going on, and they started implementing it into their own buildings, and it evolved kind of in a natural way. So instead of having a total wall length of, say, 10 meters, with a conventional church, that might be its max, the tukipilari allowed for a doubling of length with each pillar added. So essentially you have the main column stanchions, and then it was what we refer to as curtain wall in between. So this would be the simple 5.5 meter horizontal log. You can achieve a height of about 2.75 meters with that. You add a tukipilari, you immediately double the span and the width. And in some cases, some churches implemented two, which achieved even greater widths. So part of my adventure was visiting these specific churches and trying to document this tectonic condition. This is the old church of Petäjävesi, built in 1763. It's probably the best preserved and most well-known church in Finland. It was pretty incredible, actually, because it's kind of protected by water on three sides, so you have to do this kind of pilgrimage through the forest and over the river, like literally over the river through the woods. And the day I was there was a church service playing, and they're singing hymns in Finnish, and I could just hear it off into the distance, so it was like leading me in there. But as you get inside, you get a sense of the designer's attempt to maximize volume with these wood elements and capture space. So that was one of the principles of this tectonic craft was you have a limited amount of material. Yes, it's prevalent, but the processing makes it limited. And you want to capture as much space as possible with as little surface area. Something that had to be done when the building within the limits of material becomes common for this to kind of develop through time, and they only tried to push the technology and allow for larger structures. This one in particular I consider more of a hybrid type of this tukipilari because it takes the internal corners and turns them into the Lincoln log column enclosure, for lack of a better term. But it also implements this double-walled system where the overlapping of walls just reinforce that structure and then supports the roof volume. So I will jump you in time a little bit along my adventure. This is roughly 360 kilometers north from the city of Petäjävesi to Oulu, Finland, which is, I don't know if you can see, a little blue dot here. And then jumping forward about 100 years. So I got on a bus and they dropped me off. I didn't know if I was ever going to get back. But the approach was pretty incredible. Every place you go to in Finland is basically like you get dropped off in the middle of the forest, and then whatever is there is just kind of like cleared around. but it really sets up some picturesque views and adventures. So in this particular church, which is Olioki, the Tuki Pelerin can be seen almost as a type of flying buttress. It's been renovated throughout the years, so they weatherproofed this building, but you can see it on the exterior here, and the interior, these are pretty well preserved. And then they also implemented this wooden truss structure, which even allowed for greater heights. So overall, the occupiable space of these natural tectonic elements help to kind of preserve the softness and naturalness that the congregation and the communities were after as part of a place of worship. And the technology increases as the years go by. Unfortunately, so there's about 100 of these types of churches that display the Tuki Pelerin, and only about 11 remain today, and probably 2 were accessible to me. And that's because there's a harsh reality with building with timber, and it's that they burn. And it wasn't exclusive just to Finnish churches. I mean, the Great Fire of London in 1666, Great Chicago Fire of 1871, and the common reaction to this was to implement building codes that would prevent the use of timber and favor masonry. So this is the city of Helsinki, essentially almost all masonry. And another thing that kind of happens that kind of squashes out this culture of building with timber is modernism. Modernism comes along, and there's not a ton of regard for building with timber in the light of the development of steel, iron, and glass. But we did get some pretty sweet buildings like Alvar Aalto's Finlandia Hall. It was incredible to be able to experience that by myself. There was like literally no people out and about. So I went during a time where it was like a national holiday. It was midsummer. And what everyone does at midsummer is they just take off and go to their cabins on the lake. So I basically had most of the grand architecture to myself, so for better or for worse. So modernism comes along. It kind of chokes out designing with sheerly timber for a little bit. But what happens is there's a strain of architects and designers that still have that kind of longing for the tradition, and they implement it in the face of modernism. So an example of this that I visited was Otaniemi Capelli. It's now part of Aalto University in Espoo, which is just a little bit west of Helsinki. And this was designed by Kaji Siren and Heikki Siren, contemporaries with Alvar Aalto. And it takes the principles of modernism and the modernism movement and tries to re-implement these natural tectonic elements. So it takes a really basic minimal structure with nominal lumber and tension rods and creates this truss form that allows light to pour through, and you get the natural feel of the wood, the warmth, the daylight, and you're actually looking out at from the inside at the cross, which is actually placed outside in the forest. This is what it's like to drive in Finland. They drive on the right side of the road, not on the left, which I thought. But that's why you go there and find out, right? So this is on my way to an island logging town known as Sanetsalo. It was one of Alvar Aalto's experimental regions. He was entered into a competition to design the town hall for the community. It was basically a rigged competition because everyone wanted Aalto to win. There was, I think, 2 other entries that were presented. They set up a curated exhibit at the town hall when I visited, and they were like, even how they're presented today, they're kind of just jammed in the corner with all the other Aalto stuff up on the main wall. But Sanetsalo is the epitome of the early logging communities in Finland. It was founded in 1897, and this is when industry started to kind of churn out their main economic output, which was lumber. And the town hall was to function as the main government building for the town. So I'm sure some of you are at least familiar with with this building, but it's Aalto's reinterpretation of the Italian piazza, but just in Finnish vernacular. It has a council chamber, a library, and government offices, and also 2 guest bedrooms that were available on Airbnb for one day that I was there. And if you ever get a chance to stay in a famous architect's building, it's probably like one of the most incredible things you can do, because you get to spend all day there. You get to experience like what we're taught in studio, how daylight changes a space throughout time. And it was super valuable just to spend a whole day there absorbing. This is what drew me there as it relates to my topic, natural tectonic craft. It's the main feature in the council chamber, the wood-clad ceiling and a structural butterfly truss, as it's known. And what was cool there is when you stay, you get like a little private tour and a guide that leads you around and gives you insider information. And he showed me this drawing, which was actually Aalto's first iteration for this space. More subdued truss system. And what happened was he went back into revision mode, and he's like, this is not important enough to highlight the impact that comes out of this space. There's a lot of decisions being made for the community, and the butterfly truss was redesigned to emphasize that importance. Which made me wonder if this truss was built out of steel, would it have the same impact? A question for later, I think. So the second question was, what makes the building tradition important today? So what we've seen so far is that there's this culture of building with wood, constructing with timber, based out of necessity at first. The Tuki Pelerin comes along and kind of pushes that technological development. The Industrial Revolution kind of comes and subdues it, but craft and identity are brought back into this. And then the next 2 key elements here, as the 1900s roll around, is that research and technology and the economic catalyst that timber becomes for Finland really re-energizes this regional vernacular. So in the early 1900s, people are bending, layering, and reinforcing wood's property into different forms, yet the aspect of the materiality that allows it to be experienced as a natural element persist. And this is the essence of how I've been thinking about natural tectonic craft, and why we are in such an exciting time today, because we see all kinds of new developments with technology, with computational design sprouting up in our industry, and I think it will really leverage this notion that helps create a more natural architecture for the body. So an early example of this design research and development was Otto Hetzer in 1906, who's known as the father of glue lamination. Around the same time, you have Alvar Aalto experimenting with furniture design and his bent plywood. They ultimately show up in his larger scale works like Viipuri Library, reinterpreting the material in different tectonic languages. And what begins to happen in Finland around this time is basically a timber revolution. I'm trying to figure out how close a timber renaissance in the construction industry currently is, as it's dominated by concrete and steel, but Finland didn't really seem to have that kind of barrier. They just always kind of evolved their craft with wood. But what they did do is they realized that their largest natural asset was critical to the national economy. So like I said before, it was 74% of the land. They dump 30+% of their government funding into forestry management. And what's interesting is that their overall forest cover is at the top, but also the commercial forestry activity is also super high. But their net loss in the middle here, their net loss and net gain, they're actually in the positive for net gain of regrowth in their forests. And delving into that a little bit, not while I was there, but post-research, they have this strong government influence over how they protect the forest. So organizations like the Finnish Forestry Research Institute, or METLA, Natural Resources Institute of Finland, otherwise known as LUK, Somehow they translate it. I don't know. But the forestry management infrastructure is basically off the charts in Finland. And how they did it is they set up what they call wood clusters, which is where they pack into an economic model or a region the growing systems, the managing, the research, the processing, the design teams. They're all contained in small pockets around the nation. So basically every major city is a wood cluster. And their focus is more of a national cluster, leveraging tech companies, automation, architects. Rather than shipping them off to third world countries, they like to keep it all internal. And from research about how they envision the future, they have all these scenarios of like what would happen if the Chinese economy had a crash. Like, would we be able to survive internally as a nation? So the thought is for the future, but also like how to kind of protect what they have developed. And at the same time, they want to be regarded as leaders in timber research, and they want to share their knowledge with other nations. So the last part of my adventure dealt with how do all these things manifest themselves in actual built architecture. So how do you get from a pile of logs to effective spaces that engage with the human body? And I have a couple examples of where I visited that explain this. So this is Campi Chapel by K2S Architects. This was another surreal experience because Campi Chapel is located in a super busy plaza, although not evidenced by this picture because of midsummer. But there's all this hustle and bustle going around. It's one of the biggest shopping centers in Helsinki. And the goal of the project was to create this quiet place in the middle of the city that it would be completely silent. You're not allowed to talk in there, although people do. But the tectonics here kind of also reinterpret what we looked at the old church in Pelerin, this lofted form, maximizing space, and using surface area to its advantage. But being in this space was probably the most telling and the most valuable part of the whole Pellerin experience, because you would never have understood what the space is like based on a photograph. Similarly, for Loili, Helsinki, this is the coldest and hottest I've ever been in my entire life. So the sauna culture is another strong strain in the Finnish society. If you don't have a sauna, it's like, are you even Finnish? And they have these public saunas scattered about the city that you can pay a small amount, go enjoy for the day, meet up. It's a social experience. It's a spiritual experience and a health experience all in one. So this was southern Helsinki on the coast of the Baltic Sea by Avanto Architects. It's more of a hybridized tectonic expression here because they're using a steel frame and spruce slats. But again, it reinterprets this tradition that was built earlier on, contemporarily reinterpreting the horizontally stacked log. So the material allows the body to engage in multiple ways. You sweat on it, you sit on it, you step on it, you lie on it. And then you go jump in the Baltic Sea and try not to die. And it also utilizes the local materials from these wood clusters. So all of the cutting of the wood was done in a factory that was like an hour away from the site. And the local materials benefit its context because over time it weathers as it's exposed to the trade winds of the Baltic Sea. And the architects didn't want to shy away from this fact. They envisioned the evolutionary process that started here as this kind of raw, warm aesthetic, and they envisioned it turning into a rock formation on the edge of the sea. CoAD Church was in a city called Jyväskylä. It's a tech town, university city, I would say comparable to Ann Arbor, just a little larger. The intent here was a church that looks like a church. So you tell me if that was effective or not, but it reinterpreted principles of the wood church building traditions of old. So in this case, it utilized a glue lamb frame and a wooden grid shell that was fabricated in situ in 3 sections. So this went up super fast. It was, again, locally sourced spruce. And the feel on the interior was just, it's almost indescribable. I was the only person here, no surprise, except for the priest. He was very welcoming, and he said that I was probably the 40th unique country that visited on pilgrimage. So across the street from Kuokkala, the same architects, UPA, they were in charge of the Puukoka housing block, which is a pretty significant building for its breakthrough in mass timbers height. So this was the first 8-story high-rise wood housing project in Finland. It was designed as a high energy efficiency and affordable housing at the same time. So they broke multiple barriers here at once. It was modular, prefab, CLT, and it caught my interest before this trip as something we had been talking about in the office, and the CLT had come up a lot, and I had been looking into it in terms of how they developed efficiencies with their modules and how they treated the facade and things like that. But when I was actually there, I got into my Airbnb and started browsing around to try to find this place on Google Maps, and I'm like, okay, where is it? And I was like, it has to be here somewhere because I know it's there. So I got on a bus, tried to talk to like the 3 people that were on the bus. Hey, have you heard about this Puukoka housing block? I was like, where would it be? And it was there. So it just emphasizes the importance of the traveling nature of the traveling fellowship, because we can use Google Maps to inform our designs, but like in this case, I had no idea. I had to experience it in real life. So this is what it looked like when I was there on a rainy day, and this is what it looked like a few months after I left. It's all complete now. And the last piece of the puzzle in this kind of timber revolution that's happening over there is the stakes that the university hold in research and development. So I was able to visit Aalto University and the Oulu School of Architecture to talk with some professors there about the things they are doing that are progressing the technology. And these universities are not dissimilar to what we have here. So I would just challenge all the students here to keep asking ourselves like how our time in school can impact the larger narrative of our profession. Because what they're doing in their studios, I mean, it's like hardcore wood all the time. Like that's all you see. It's like large scale, small scale. And then it's not limited to the architecture universities. They're developing laser scanning technology in their mills that will essentially CAT scan full logs, map the sap deposits, and calibrate the saws to cut around those. So it's a much more efficient process, and they can pump out more product in less time. And similarly with the colleges, complete colleges that are dedicated to forestry management, biology, they all have this kind of common goal in keeping up this culture that was rooted in tradition, but it's also like a major economic driver now. And that's essentially what has boosted them to be leaders in their field. So with that, I hope this has kind of shed a little bit of light on the experts in our community and across our community and how we might be able to implement that in the trajectory that we're heading now. So thank you. And I'm sure there's a bunch of questions. Yeah, Sandy? Oh.
So we need to use the microphone for questions for the folks who are watching. Great. So questions?
Hey, great presentation, by the way.
Hey, thank you, I appreciate that.
You're welcome. I have a quick question about what kind of process did you find yourself preparing for the research travel? Like, did you go in with a preconception of like what you'd be finding or like basic questions, or did you just kind of let it come to life and then go from there?
Yeah, I totally came in with preconceptions. And in fact, I was just telling my colleague Safi about this about an hour ago. I thought that I was going to be studying like wood joinery, and that was going to be it, and readapting it to digital tool sets. But I did a little bit of like preview searching and trying to figure out like, okay, what's backing this? Why did this come to be? And that the one question that came out is like, oh, I should probably study the culture and the background of this before I dive in. And that's what captured it and kind of reframed the research. So I would say it's good to have some conceits going in, but also it's also important to be flexible in how like, what your findings are can redirect your path. And there's still a lot that I could do with this. I mean, I haven't gotten into the whole economic like quantification of like taking a side of timber or steel or concrete. That's a whole can of worms, but there's a lot that I can still do. And I thought this was a pretty good start, and I had a lot of fun doing it.
Where do you see the technology for wood use and timber use going? Like, do you see it more for commercial use or residential use or things like that?
Why limit it is, I guess, I would say. It can be both residential and commercial. I think we definitely have the technological like brain power to do this kind of thing. What's kind of holding us back now is like prescriptive building codes, and I think that's something that is being worked on as we speak. But from a technological side, I think we can definitely progress that and take cues from what's happening in Finland.
Other questions?
Kloos.
So, a couple questions. How pivotal was the kind of cultural tradition associated with forestry and the foresting industry on catalyzing wood as a economic driver and a building material?
So first, I just think that it set up like this value in society where that's what sustained them through like the hardships. So wood was seen in this light as like a positive entity, and that kind of drove basically how they developed their economy. In the same grain, no pun intended, it was a resource that was like super available, right? So it was either like they exploit that or they find something else. So I think it was almost kind of a default that evolved naturally. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. And a follow-up on that, how pivotal have advancements in technology in adjacent industries been on the advancement of wood as a construction material, just thinking of glues and resins and binders?
Yeah. So I know from visiting the universities that the different domains involved, like biology, management, they see that just as pivotal because it's all interconnected, right? So, for instance, one example would be they're collecting active data on the forest. Every tree, every seedling that gets planted now is tracked, so they can keep tabs on a seedling all the way to a mature tree and where that goes, and then they're pouring that data back into analytics and actively managing forests in a more efficient manner that way. So that would be one example. I would say extremely pivotal.
Anybody else? Yes.
Hi, I was just wondering if you think that the wood renaissance is in the works right now or if it's down the line.
I think it's happening. I mean, what was it, a couple years ago, they passed a new amendment to the code in Seattle, I believe, which increased the height of what a high-rise is considered. Oregon? Yeah, Oregon, Portland. It increased the buildable limit of a non-combustible material. So I think as this narrative of sustainable architecture also progresses, it's just going to become more of a necessity rather than like a desired approach. Because whether we like it or not, we're kind of headed down this path where reuse and adaptation is going to be needed.
Thanks.
Was there another question from someone else? Okay, you first.
So in Finland, the availability of the wood is paramount, 72%, you said, of the ground cover. Where is this viable in the States? I know northern Michigan looks a lot like the pictures you showed,
Yeah.
Washington, Oregon. I mean, is this Renaissance going to be the northern portions of the United States?
Yeah, like if we were to reorientate like our own wood clusters, like in a specific region, probably the northwest portion of the states, northern Michigan. Canada would probably have a big role in that. But it's probably based on proximity to these types of trees, birch, fir, and spruce.
Your lecture title is Natural Tectonic Craft, and it's based on material. So would you think that, because natural tectonic or tectonic, I want to say is a terminology in architecture, do you think material shapes identity in architecture?
Material is certainly one way to create an identity. It's not a limiting factor. It's not the only factor. But we engage with it, right? Our bodies engage with it. Our senses engage with material. And it's important for setting up meaning in architecture, in my opinion.
Is there a follow-up question. Is there like a volume 2? Because this is a natural tectonic craft. Is there like going to be like another trip somewhere else with a different focus on material?
Possibly. I'm going to Zimbabwe in 10 days.
Okay. Find the material.
Okay, thanks everybody. If you have any other questions, I think maybe you could ask Erik informally. We're going to have a reception after this is all over in the Brick Gallery in the old architecture building. Thanks,
Thank you.
Erik.
Yeah.
All right, so we're getting into a different part of this lecture tonight. So the second part of this is to talk about this year's nominees. So Dr. Geyer's going to help me introduce this year's all of the nominees that submitted proposals this year. So for those of you that are in attendance tonight, please come down here and we have a certificate for you and be recognized. Do you want to read the names?
Sure, I'll do the names, and I apologize if I mispronounce anyone's name. This year we had 5 students who were nominated and submitted applications. Thank you. And those students were Darpan Aurora. Please. Thank you. Michael Bluth, who I know is not here. Paul Codriano. Oh, no. Congratulations. Simon Altair. Got the right ones, right? I think I put them in order. Congratulations. And Ala Makdat. Congratulations.
congratulations again for being nominated for the Pellerin. I just want to take a brief introduction, take a little bit of an introduction into going over exactly what the Pelerin Traveling Fellowship is. I think Erik did a great job with his presentation tonight in all of his travel studies. He really exemplified what we were looking for in this travel fellowship. Just want to give you a little peek behind the curtain of what we're looking for any future nominees that will be developing a proposal. As I mentioned earlier, this is an award that is it is selected for from the graduate professors in the design studios or thesis process. There's usually about 10 to 12 people that are nominated for this for that year. And when we're looking at those proposals, we are looking for an outline of plans of what they intend to accomplish, as well as contacts for people in those regions that they wish to travel to, as well as a budget and costs associated with what that travel is. We want to make sure that this is realistic and that it's something that you can accomplish and that you're able to limit what you are doing and be focused. We received several proposals this year that were lacking in one of these areas, and so I can't stress enough having an outline, having a budget, and having contacts within the regions that you wish to travel to. There were a few that stood out, and among those, it was a hard choice, I have to say, this year. This year's recipient provided a proposal that was well-conceived and compelling, and it was very clear what they wanted to do. It was also quite encouraging to see their course of study. They had a clear and well-faceted approach to their study and had a strong sense of academic vigor. So, with that said, after deliberation involving several of these deserving candidates, we had to choose one. And the selection committee has named the recipient for the 2019 Pellerin Traveling Fellowship to be Simon Alatar. Simon's proposal was to study concrete architecture. He outlined several characteristics in which he wanted to research, those involving precast and different ways of casting concrete. He is going to be spending the better part of 2 weeks traveling to Denmark and the Netherlands, as well as to his home country of Canada. And with that concludes the night. We're going to go have refreshments down in the Brick Gallery. There's also an exhibit down there for Erik's work, and lots of time to ask more questions to Erik and ask questions to Simon about his future studies. And I welcome you all back here next spring for Simon's lecture. So thank you all for coming tonight.